The night Madeline Brooks was erased from her marriage. It was raining over Manhattan. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies. Just a cold, steady rain that soaked through her thin coat as she stood barefoot on the marble floor of the penthouse she had once called home. Her suitcase was already by the door, not packed by her, packed for her. Julian Whitmore didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He stood near the window, skyline lights cutting his reflection into sharp angles, his Mont Blanc pen resting calmly between his fingers, as if this were just another business meeting, the kind where emotions were irrelevant. "This isn't working anymore," he said, checking his Rolex. "You'll find something temporary. My lawyer will handle the rest." Madeline's mouth opened, but no sound came out. 10 years of marriage collapsed into that single sentence. She looked past him, hoping, stupidly, that there would be an explanation, or hesitation, or regret. Instead, the elevator chimed. Their son, Ethan, stood frozen in the hallway, clutching his backpack with both hands. He had been half asleep when he heard voices. Now he was wide awake, eyes darting between his parents, sensing something was wrong, but not yet understanding what. Julian didn't look at him. "I'll have my driver take the boy to school tomorrow," Julian added flatly. "You won't be needed." That was when Madeline understood. This wasn't just a breakup. It was a removal. She was being cut out of a life she had helped build, replaced like an outdated contract. She knelt in front of Ethan, smoothing his hair with trembling fingers, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "Mommy just needs a little time, okay?" Ethan nodded, too quietly, too obediently. The door closed behind her with a soft click. No shouting, no scene. Just the sound of a woman being erased from her own life. Madeline stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut, on the only home she had known for a decade, unaware that this moment, this humiliation, was the beginning of something far more dangerous than Julian Whitmore could ever imagine. Because the woman he threw out that night was the same woman who would one day decide his fate. Madeline didn't remember how long she stood outside the building. The rain soaked her hair, then her clothes, then the thin fabric of the dress she'd worn to dinner that night, because she had still believed she was a wife. A doorman glanced at her once, then looked away. In Manhattan, dignity was expensive, and sympathy was rare. Her phone buzzed, a notification. "Your access to this account has been suspended." Then another, and another. Her banking app, the joint credit card, the shared savings account she had helped build line by line, budget by budget, sacrifice by sacrifice, gone in less than 60 seconds. Madeline sat on the cold stone steps and stared at the screen, her fingers numb. Julian hadn't just thrown her out. He had erased her financially, methodically, like closing tabs on a browser. She booked the cheapest motel she could find across the river in New Jersey. The room smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet. The mattress sagged in the middle, like it had already given up on anyone who slept there. She locked the door, then slid down against it. Only then did the tears come. Not loud, not dramatic, just silent shaking as she pressed her fist against her mouth so no one would hear her break. 10 years of marriage replayed in fragments. Late nights balancing accounts, canceled vacations, dinners eaten alone while Julian closed deals. She had believed in them, in him, in the lie that endurance would be rewarded. At dawn, she woke up without realizing she had slept. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Julian's attorney. Polite, precise, cold. "Temporary custody has been filed. Given your current employment status, We advise compliance. Madeline stared at the words until they blurred. They were taking her son. She walked to the small bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Pale, hollow-eyed, older than she had been 48 hours ago. She turned on the faucet and let the water run, steadying herself. In the silence of that motel room, something shifted. This pain wasn't chaotic. It was organized, calculated. And for the first time, Madeline understood the truth she had avoided for years. Julian hadn't won because he was stronger. He had won because she had stopped believing she deserved more. Her hands tightened into fists. That would not happen again. Because the woman who had nothing left to lose was far more dangerous than the wife he had once controlled. The first headline appeared before noon. Madeline saw it on her phone while standing in line at a Starbucks near the motel, her hands wrapped around a paper cup she hadn't paid for yet, because she was still calculating how much she had left. The barista called the next name. Madeline didn't move. She was frozen, staring at the screen. Sources confirm Julian Whitmore and wife separate amid irreconcilable differences. She scrolled. Another article. Then another. Photos followed. Julian stepping out of a black sedan, composed and confident, with Haley Monroe at his side. The captions were cruel in their politeness. New chapter. Power couple. A necessary evolution. Madeline felt the room tilt. No mention of the midnight eviction. No mention of the locked accounts. No mention of a mother separated from her child before sunrise. In the public story, Julian was decisive, strategic, brave enough to move on. And she was invisible. Her phone buzzed again, a message from an unfamiliar number. Madeline, this is Haley. I think it's best if you accept what's happening and move forward with dignity. Dignity. Madeline laughed under her breath, a short, broken sound that startled the woman behind her in line. She paid for her coffee with cash and stepped outside, the city moving around her as if nothing had changed. But everything had. By afternoon, social media accounts she barely used were filled with speculation. Some comments were curious, others were vicious. She never fit his world. He upgraded. She must have been dead weight. Madeline sat on a bench across the street and read every word, each one landing like a quiet slap. Not because they were true, but because they echoed the doubts she had swallowed for years. That night her lawyer called, not to comfort her, to warn her. Julian's team is pushing a narrative, he said carefully. They want you framed as unstable, unemployed, unfit. The words settled heavy in her chest. This wasn't just divorce. It was erasure at scale. Madeline looked out at the passing headlights, the blur of lives untouched by her collapse. She thought of Ethan, probably eating dinner in a penthouse that no longer belonged to her, being told a version of the truth shaped by lawyers and press releases. Her throat tightened. But beneath the humiliation, something sharper began to form. They had underestimated one thing. Silence did not mean surrender. And if Julian wanted a story, Madeline would make sure the ending belonged to her. Because humiliation was never the end of her story. It was the trigger. The motel room emptied into morning like a bad habit Madeline couldn't shake. She checked out early, rolling her suitcase past the front desk without making eye contact. Outside, traffic hummed with purpose. Everyone seemed to know where they were going. She didn't. She drove until the skyline thinned, then parked near a small shopping plaza where no one would recognize her. Inside a Barnes & Noble, the air smelled like paper and coffee. It felt safe in a quiet, anonymous way. Madeline wandered the aisles without direction, fingers brushing spines as if touching something solid might steady her. She stopped in the self-help section without realizing how she'd gotten there. One book caught her eye: Atomic Habits. She sat on the carpeted floor between shelves and opened it. Not because she believed in miracles, but because she needed something that promised order when everything else had collapsed. Small steps, systems, consistency. The words felt simple, almost insulting. And yet, she kept reading. Hours passed. Her phone stayed silent. No messages from Julian, no updates about Ethan. The absence hurt more than cruelty. It suggested she no longer mattered enough to manage. When she finally stood, her legs were stiff, her reflection in the glass doors unfamiliar. She paid in cash, slipped the book into her bag, and walked across the parking lot to a Starbucks. She ordered the cheapest drink and sat by the window, watching people type on laptops, laugh softly, live. This was the bottom. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just a woman with no address, no income, no child in her arms, and no one waiting for her. That night, back in the motel, Madeline opened her old MacBook. The battery barely held a charge. The screen flickered like it was tired too. She pulled up spreadsheets she hadn't touched in years. Old models, old ideas, skills she'd buried to make space for someone else's ambition. At first, her hands shook. Then they steadied. Numbers had always made sense to her: patterns, risk, cause, and effect. For the first time since she'd been thrown out, something inside her aligned. Not hope, focus. She worked until sunrise. By dawn, she wasn't healed, she wasn't confident, she wasn't safe. But she had one thing Julian had taken for granted: a mind that was waking up. Madeline closed the laptop and stared at the ceiling, exhaustion heavy but different now, earned, purposeful. Because the woman who reached the bottom and chose to build instead of beg had just taken her first step back. Madeline saw Ethan 3 days later. It wasn't a reunion. It was a scheduled visit, supervised, limited to 1 hour in a quiet family room downtown that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet. The kind of place designed to keep emotions contained. Julian didn't come himself. He never did when there was nothing to gain. Ethan walked in slowly, his backpack hanging low on one shoulder. He looked smaller than Madeline remembered, like the space between them had already taken something away. When he saw her, his face brightened, then tightened, as if he wasn't sure he was allowed to be happy. She knelt, arms open, and he stepped into them without hesitation. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Madeline breathed him in. The familiar scent of his shampoo, the warmth of his body. Proof that some things were still real. They sat at a small table with crayons and paper no one touched. A woman with a clipboard pretended not to listen. Madeline asked about school, about his math test, about the book he was reading. She avoided the word home. Ethan studied her face with the seriousness only children had. "Mom," he said quietly, "did you do something bad?" The question landed heavier than any headline. Madeline swallowed. "Why would you think that?" He shrugged, eyes dropping to the table. "Dad says grown-ups don't always tell the truth. He says you left because you didn't want to try anymore." Madeline felt something tear inside her chest. Not anger, not panic, just grief. She took his hands. "Ethan, listen to me. I didn't leave you. I would never leave you." He looked up then, eyes shining but steady. "I know." She froze. "You do?" He nodded. You always stayed, even when Dad was busy, even when you were tired. He paused, then added softly, You didn't break our family. He did. The supervisor shifted uncomfortably. Madeline's vision blurred. She pressed her forehead to his, breathing through the moment. She wanted to cry. She wanted to scream. Instead, she smiled. Thank you, she whispered. When the hour ended, Ethan hugged her tight. You're going to be okay, he said, with the confidence of someone who believed it completely. As Madeline walked back to her car alone, something inside her changed shape. She was no longer just surviving for herself. She was fighting for the truth. Because when a child sees clearly through the lies, the story is already turning. Madeline didn't plan to meet anyone that day. She sat alone at a corner table in Starbucks, the kind tucked near an outlet, her old MacBook plugged in like a lifeline. The screen was filled with rows of numbers, risk projections, cash flow assumptions, failure points most people never bothered to examine. She worked in silence, nursing the same coffee long after it went cold. Across the room, Daniel Cross noticed her because she didn't look like everyone else. She wasn't scrolling, she wasn't chatting, she wasn't pretending to work. Her posture was still, focused, almost severe, as if the spreadsheet in front of her mattered more than the world around it. Daniel had spent 20 years in boardrooms. He recognized intensity when he saw it. He didn't interrupt. An hour passed, then 2. Madeline stood to leave, distracted, brushing past his table. A single page slipped from her bag and landed at his feet. She didn't notice. She was already halfway to the door when Daniel picked it up. One glance was enough. The analysis was sharp, unusually sharp. Not polished, not pretty, but honest. It identified weaknesses most firms hid from investors. Daniel felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the kind that came when he saw something rare. "Excuse me," he called out. Madeline turned, guarded. "You dropped this." She took the paper quickly, embarrassment flashing across her face. "Sorry, it's nothing important." Daniel smiled faintly. "That's not true." She hesitated. "I'm Daniel Cross," he said simply. "No title, no credentials." Madeline nodded. "Madeline," he gestured to the page. "You mind if I ask what company this is?" She studied him for a moment, weighing risk out of habit. "It's a hypothetical," she said finally, "modeled after a real firm." Daniel's smile widened. "You see the cracks most people ignore." Madeline's shoulders stiffened. "Cracks don't matter if you don't have power." Daniel leaned back. "Power comes later. Clarity comes first." Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, curious. "I'm not offering you a job," Daniel said after a beat, "but I am offering a conversation." Madeline almost laughed. She had lost everything: trust, security, her child's daily presence. And yet, something about his tone wasn't pity. It was respect. She closed her laptop slowly. "Okay," she said. "One conversation." Daniel nodded. "Good. Let's see what you're really capable of." Because the most dangerous alliances don't begin with promises. They begin with recognition. Daniel Cross didn't invite Madeline to an office. He sent her an address in Midtown and a time. No explanation, no agenda. When she arrived, it wasn't a boardroom or a glass tower. It was a quiet conference space above a private equity firm, neutral and deliberately unimpressive. A place designed to strip away intimidation and leave only substance. Daniel was already there, seated at the far end of the table. "You have 48 hours," he said without preamble, sliding a thin folder across the surface. "This company is bleeding. but no one can prove it yet. I want to know if it's worth saving. Madeline opened the folder. Her stomach tightened. The firm was Midtown Capital, Julian's firm. She looked up slowly. Is this a joke? Daniel's expression didn't change. It's a test. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Every instinct told her to walk out. This wasn't just business. This was personal. Dangerous. Julian's legal team had already framed her as unstable. One wrong move, and she would hand them exactly what they wanted. I can't touch this, she said carefully. He'll say I'm acting out of spite. Daniel nodded. That's why you'll either do it perfectly or not at all. Madeline pushed the folder back. You're asking me to walk into a fire. No, Daniel replied. I'm asking you to decide whether your fear still runs your life. The words landed hard. She gathered the documents and left without answering. That night in the motel room, Madeline stared at the ceiling while rain tapped against the window. She thought of Ethan, of the headlines, of Julian's calm smile as he erased her. She thought of the woman she had become by staying silent. By morning, the answer was clear. She worked for 2 days straight. No emotion, no shortcuts, just numbers. Cash flows that didn't add up. Shell entities buried under clean reports. Risk exposures masked by confidence and reputation. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking. She returned the folder to Daniel and sat back, exhausted. Well, he asked. Madeline met his eyes. It's worse than it looks, and if this goes public, he's finished. Daniel studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. You passed, he said. Madeline exhaled, not in relief, but in realization. She hadn't failed the test. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. Because the moment she chose truth over fear, there was no turning back. Julian Whitmore sensed something was wrong before anyone said a word. It started with silence. Calls that used to be returned in minutes went unanswered. A lunch meeting was postponed, then rescheduled, then quietly canceled. In his world, hesitation was a warning sign, and Julian had built his career on reading those signs before others did. Madeline felt it from the opposite side. 3 days after Daniel's test, her phone rang while she was reviewing notes in her motel room. The number was blocked. She answered anyway. This is a courtesy notice, a man said, voice smooth and practiced. You are hereby advised to cease any professional activity that may interfere with ongoing legal proceedings involving Mr. Whitmore. Madeline closed her eyes. Julian had noticed. By evening, her temporary consulting access was revoked. A cease and desist email followed, heavy with legal language and thinly veiled threats. They accused her of acting in bad faith, of using insider knowledge, of being emotionally compromised. Daniel read the email without comment. They're trying to scare you out, he said finally. It's working, Madeline replied quietly. Her hands trembled despite her effort to stay still. If they freeze me out completely, I'm done. Daniel leaned forward. Then you'll do what they don't expect. The next morning, Madeline received an invitation, not from Julian, but from one of Midtown Capital's minor partners. Coffee, off the record. Curious, not confrontational. A crack in the wall Julian thought was solid. She almost said no. Instead, she went. She didn't accuse, she didn't warn. She asked questions, listened, let the other man talk himself into doubt. By the time the coffee cups were empty, she hadn't revealed a single fact, yet the partner was visibly unsettled. That afternoon, another email arrived. Then another. Quiet inquiries, careful ones. Julian's attempt to silence her had done the opposite. That night, Madeline sat alone, staring at her laptop, exhaustion pressing down on her chest. She had no safety net. One misstep could cost her everything: her chance at her son, her credibility, her future. Fear whispered that this was too much, but another voice, steadier now, answered back. She had survived being erased. She could survive being hunted. Because when power moves to crush someone, it often reveals just how fragile it truly is. Daniel didn't sugarcoat it. They sat across from each other in a quiet office borrowed for the afternoon, sunlight cutting across the table in sharp lines. Madeline listened as he laid out the numbers, the risks, the timelines. This wasn't a rescue. It was a gamble dressed up as opportunity. There's a fund spinning off from this mess, Daniel said. Early stage, high volatility. If it works, it changes everything. If it doesn't, he let the sentence hang. Madeline finished it for him. I walk away with nothing. Daniel nodded. And they'll say you proved them right. She leaned back, heart pounding. The proposal was clean on paper, brutal in reality. She would step into a role without protection, without public backing, and without room for error. Julian's lawyers would be watching. The press would be waiting. One wrong headline could destroy her credibility for good. I don't have margin for mistakes, she said quietly. I'm already fighting to see my son. Daniel met her gaze. That's exactly why you do. Madeline went back to the motel that night and didn't turn on the lights. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her phone. A photo of Ethan smiled back at her from the lock screen, taken years ago when life still felt stable, safe. She imagined losing again, losing publicly, losing in a way that would follow her forever. Fear pressed in from every direction. Then another thought surfaced, uninvited but clear. What if she won? What if this was the moment that rewrote everything? The custody hearings, the headlines, the power dynamic Julian thought he controlled. By dawn, she had made her choice. She met Daniel later that morning, eyes tired but steady. I'll do it, she said, but on one condition. Daniel raised an eyebrow. I don't play defense, Madeline continued. If I step in, I lead. Fully. No hiding. A slow smile crossed Daniel's face. That's the answer I was hoping for. They shook hands. As Madeline walked out, she felt the weight of the decision settle into her bones. There was no safety net now, no retreat, only forward. Because when a woman chooses risk over erasure, she doesn't just change her future. She challenges everyone who underestimated her. The failure came faster than anyone expected. 3 weeks into Madeline's new role, the market shifted. Not dramatically, not with a crash, just a quiet, merciless adjustment that punished overconfidence and exposed weak foundations. The kind of shift seasoned investors noticed too late. By noon, her phone wouldn't stop vibrating. A supplier pulled out. A secondary investor froze their commitment. A blog post appeared questioning the fund's leadership, thinly veiled, but sharp enough to cut. Madeline sat alone in the borrowed office, watching red numbers stack on her screen. The projections she had trusted bent under pressure. Not broken, but close enough that the difference felt academic. Daniel stood by the window, arms crossed. We expected resistance, he said carefully. Not this much, this soon. Madeline nodded, throat tight. She had known the risk. She had chosen it. Still, the reality landed hard. If this collapsed publicly, Julian's narrative would write itself. Reckless, emotional, proving she never belonged in the room. That afternoon, a message arrived from Julian himself. No greeting, no hostility, just one sentence. Walk away now before you embarrass yourself further. Madeline stared at the screen, pulse pounding. The old instinct flared, the urge to retreat, to minimize damage, to survive quietly. It was the instinct that had kept her married long after the truth was obvious. She stood slowly and closed her laptop. I need access to everything, she told Daniel. All contracts, all exposure. No filters. Daniel hesitated. If you're wrong, I know, she said. But if I'm right, this isn't a failure. It's a map. She worked through the night, fueled by cold coffee and stubborn clarity. Somewhere near dawn, she saw it. A pattern hidden beneath the chaos. A pressure point no one had questioned because it came from a trusted source. By morning, she was exhausted and certain. Daniel listened as she laid it out, his expression unreadable. When she finished, silence filled the room. This could save it, he said slowly, or destroy it completely. Madeline met his eyes. Then we stop hesitating. Outside, the city woke up, unaware that something fragile was about to be tested. Because the fall everyone expected to end her was actually the moment she learned where the real power was hiding. The room was quiet after Madeline finished speaking. Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to react. He simply looked at the data again, slower this time, as if seeing it through a different lens. The early losses that had panicked the investors, the sudden withdrawals, the timing that felt random until it didn't. This wasn't market pressure, he said finally. Madeline nodded. It was engineered. She pointed to the screen. A subsidiary buried 3 layers deep, a consulting firm that appeared neutral, trusted, invisible. The same firm Midtown Capital had quietly recommended to multiple partners over the years. Julian's fingerprints weren't obvious, but they were there. He created volatility, Madeline continued, then positioned himself to profit from it. The fund wasn't failing. It was being squeezed. Daniel exhaled slowly. If we expose this, it doesn't just save the fund. It exposes him, Madeline said. Legally. The word hung between them. By noon, Daniel made the call. The narrative shifted fast. The same blogs that questioned Madeline's leadership began publishing updates, clarifications. New information. Analysts walked back their early assumptions. Investors requested meetings instead of exits. The losses didn't vanish, but they stopped accelerating. Madeline watched the numbers stabilize in real time, exhaustion giving way to something steadier. Validation. That afternoon, Daniel brought her into a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city. No drama, no applause. You saw what no one else did, he said, and you didn't panic. She smiled faintly. I didn't have the luxury. Daniel slid a folder across the table. The board agrees. We need you leading this, officially. Madeline didn't open it right away. What about the optics? She asked. Julian will say he already is, Daniel interrupted, and it's not working. She opened the folder. CEO. The title felt unreal, heavy, earned. That evening, Madeline called Ethan. They talked about homework, about a science project, normal things. Before hanging up, he said quietly, You sound different, Mom. How? She asked. Stronger, he said. Madeline closed her eyes, emotion rising in her chest. The failure that almost ended her had revealed the truth. She hadn't been wrong. She had been early. And the woman they tried to break was now standing exactly where she belonged. The invitation arrived sealed and formal, embossed with gold lettering. The Plaza Hotel Annual Financial Leadership Gala. Madeline held the card for a long moment before setting it down on her desk. Through the glass walls of her new office, Manhattan glowed in the early evening light, calm and indifferent. She knew exactly who would be there. She knew exactly who would not expect her. Julian Whitmore had never missed this gala.
Neither had she, when she used to stand 2 steps behind him smiling politely, introduced as my wife, like a footnote. That night, Madeline arrived alone. The car pulled up beneath the bright awning, cameras flashing as guests stepped out in tailored suits and designer gowns. Madeline smoothed the fabric of her dress and walked forward, not rushing, not hesitating. She felt the weight of 100 glances before anyone recognized her. Inside, the ballroom shimmered with crystal and low conversation. Laughter floated through the air, practiced and strategic. Julian stood near the center, confident as ever, Haley Monroe at his side in a sleek gown that caught the light. He was mid-sentence when the room shifted. Someone whispered her name. Julian turned. For a fraction of a second, his composure slipped. Not shock, something closer to disbelief, like seeing a ghost that had learned how to breathe again. Haley followed his gaze, her smile tightening as she took Madeline in from head to toe. Madeline didn't look at either of them. She checked in at the registration desk, signed her name, and took her place among the attendees as if she had never left this world at all. Conversations resumed around her, quieter now, curious, recalculating. Midway through the evening, the host stepped onto the stage. "Please welcome the newest leader in our industry," he announced, pausing just long enough. "CEO of Atlas Ridge's emerging fund, Madeline Brooks." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger. Julian didn't clap. Madeline walked to the stage with steady steps, her pulse calm, her expression unreadable. From the podium, she scanned the room once and met Julian's eyes. This time she didn't look away, because the woman he erased had returned, not for permission, but for recognition. The applause faded, but the tension didn't. Madeline stepped down from the stage and accepted a glass of water from a staff member, her hand steady despite the sudden attention. Around her, conversations restarted in careful tones, like traders testing the market after unexpected news. People smiled at her now, some with curiosity, some with calculation. Julian watched from across the room, his jaw set, eyes narrowed. He told himself this was temporary, a fluke, a sympathy appointment engineered by Daniel Cross. He had seen weaker people rise and fall before. Then his phone vibrated. A message from his CFO. "We need to talk immediately." Julian excused himself, forcing a smile for Haley. "Business," he murmured. She nodded, distracted by a group of admirers who had already turned their attention away from him. In a quiet corner near the terrace, Julian read the email that followed. Atlas Ridge had acquired a controlling position in one of Midtown Capital's most sensitive financing vehicles. Not a hostile takeover, not public. Quiet, precise, legal. His chest tightened. He scanned the document again, disbelief giving way to something colder. The structure was flawless. Too flawless. Whoever had designed it knew exactly where Midtown was vulnerable and exactly how to move without triggering alarms. He looked up. Madeline stood 10 feet away, speaking calmly with an investor Julian had tried to court for months. She wasn't posturing. She wasn't boasting. She was explaining, and the man was listening.
Julian approached, pulse hammering. "You planned this," he said under his breath when she turned to him. Madeline met his eyes without blinking. "No," she replied evenly. "I prepared for it." He scoffed. "You think this ends well for you?" She tilted her head slightly. "I think it ends honestly." Julian's phone buzzed again. Another message, another confirmation. The leverage he had relied on, gone. The protections he had assumed were permanent, exposed.
For the first time that night, uncertainty crept into his expression. Madeline stepped closer, her voice low, controlled. "You taught me something, Julian. Power isn't loud. It's patient." She turned away before he could respond, leaving him standing alone amid the hum of the gala, watching alliances shift in real time. This wasn't revenge. It was consequence. And the man who thought he controlled the board had just realized the game had moved without him. The custody hearing was scheduled for the following week, but Ethan asked to speak before that. It wasn't a demand, it was a request, delivered through Julian's attorney with a tone that suggested inconvenience more than concern. Madeline read the message twice, then set her phone down, her chest tightening in a way boardrooms never managed to do. They met in a quiet conference room at the courthouse, sunlight filtering through narrow windows. No toys, no bright colors, just a long table and 3 chairs. Ethan sat between his parents, feet not touching the floor, hands folded carefully in his lap. The mediator spoke gently, explained the purpose, asked if Ethan understood why he was there. He nodded. "Do you know why your parents live separately now?" she asked. Ethan looked at his shoes, then up at Madeline. She didn't speak. She didn't nod. She let him decide. "Yes," he said. "They don't agree about what matters." Julian shifted beside him. "Ethan," the mediator raised a hand. "Let him finish." Ethan took a breath. "Dad says Mom made bad choices. But Mom always came to my school. She always helped me when I was scared." He paused, then added quietly, "Dad was busy a lot." The room went still. Julian's jaw tightened. "That's not fair." Ethan turned to him, eyes steady. "You told me to be honest." Madeline felt tears rise, but she kept her gaze on the table, her hands clasped tightly together. The mediator leaned forward. "Ethan, where do you feel safest?" He didn't hesitate. "With Mom." Julian stood abruptly. "This is inappropriate." The mediator remained calm. "It's his voice." Ethan looked up at Madeline then, a small smile breaking through the tension. "You're not broken," he said. "You just had to start over." Madeline closed her eyes, breath catching. Outside, Julian argued with his attorney. Inside, Madeline knelt in front of her son, pulling him into her arms, holding him like something sacred and irreplaceable. This wasn't a victory earned through leverage or strategy. It was earned through presence. And as Madeline walked out of the courthouse with Ethan's hand in hers, she understood something with absolute clarity. Power could be taken, but truth, once spoken, could not be erased. Julian Whitmore's fall didn't happen in a single moment. It unfolded the way real consequences always do, quietly at first, then all at once. 2 days after the custody hearing, Midtown Capital's board called an emergency meeting. Not announced, not public. The kind of meeting that meant decisions had already been made before anyone entered the room. Julian arrived early, suit immaculate, confidence practiced. He still believed he could talk his way out. He was wrong. The questions came fast, about offshore structures, about undisclosed advisory fees,
about conflicts of interest that had been ignored for years because the returns were strong enough to justify silence. This time, the numbers didn't lie. Atlas Ridge's involvement had forced scrutiny no one could delay anymore. By the end of the meeting, Julian was asked to step aside temporarily. The word meant nothing. By evening, the news leaked. Carefully worded headlines, internal review, leadership transition. Investors didn't panic, but they adjusted. Quietly, relentlessly. The kind of shift Julian once engineered against others. Haley Monroe noticed the change before he did.
Dinner reservations were canceled. Invitations stopped coming. The calls she'd relied on went unanswered. When she asked Julian what was happening, he snapped for the first time since she'd known him. "Give it time," he said sharply. She didn't. Within a week, she was gone. No confrontation, no goodbye, just absence. The same way Julian had erased Madeline when she no longer served his image. Julian sat alone in the penthouse one night, the city spread out below him, lights cold and distant. The silence felt heavier now. There was no one to perform for, no one to reassure. He checked his phone. Madeline hadn't called, she hadn't messaged, she hadn't needed to. That was the part he hadn't anticipated. The punishment wasn't public humiliation. It wasn't revenge. It was irrelevance. The world moved on without him, adjusting to new power centers, new leaders, new narratives. And Madeline stood firmly among them, not watching him fall, but building something that didn't include him at all. Julian finally understood the cost of what he had done. Not the marriage, not the money, the certainty. Because the woman he thought he had broken had become the standard he could never reach again. Madeline didn't celebrate Julian's collapse. There were no champagne toasts, no victory dinners, no quiet satisfaction taken from watching his name fade from invitations and headlines. She had learned something important during the months she rebuilt herself. Celebration tied to another person's downfall never lasted. Instead, she focused on what came next. The legal documents arrived on a Tuesday morning, neat and precise. Revised custody terms, financial disclosures, final settlements. Madeline read them slowly in her office, sunlight spilling across the desk, the city moving below as if this were just another workday. In a way, it was. Julian requested a meeting. Daniel offered to handle it. Madeline declined. They met in a neutral conference room, small and undecorated. No assistants, no lawyers. Just two people who had once shared a life and now shared nothing but history. Julian looked older. Not dramatically so, but worn around the edges, like someone who had spent too long believing control was permanent. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. Madeline folded her hands. "I didn't do this to you." "You could have finished me," he pressed. "You had the leverage." She nodded once. "I know." Julian searched her face, frustrated. "Then why didn't you?" Madeline considered the question. "Because I don't need to." The answer landed harder than any accusation. She slid the papers across the table. "This is fair. It protects Ethan. It closes things cleanly. I'm not interested in dragging this out." Julian laughed bitterly. "You always were good at pretending you were above it." Madeline met his eyes. "I'm not pretending." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Julian signed. When Madeline stood to leave, he spoke again. "Do you ever regret it, leaving?" She paused at the door. "I regret staying longer than I should have." Outside, she breathed deeply, the tension leaving her shoulders. There was no triumph in her chest, just relief, closure. That evening, she picked Ethan up from school. They walked home together, talking about his day, his plans, the future. Julian was no longer the center of the story. He was a chapter that had ended. Because mercy without forgiveness is still strength, and walking away clean is the most powerful ending of all. Julian Whitmore woke up one morning and realized the noise was gone. No alerts, no urgent emails, no assistants waiting for instructions. For the first time in over a decade, his phone sat silent on the nightstand, screen dark, untouched. The world he had once commanded no longer needed him to explain, approve, or decide. It had already adjusted. He dressed out of habit, not purpose. The suit still fit. The mirror still reflected a man who looked powerful on the surface. But when he stepped outside, the doorman barely nodded. Not out of disrespect, out of indifference. That hurt more than recognition ever could. At Midtown Capital, his former office had been reassigned, his name removed from the directory. The firm's website now highlighted new leadership and forward momentum. There was no mention of him, not even a footnote. Julian sat in a cafe he used to frequent, watching younger executives talk loudly about deals he once would have led. No one asked for his opinion. No one noticed when he left. That afternoon, he searched Madeline's name online. The results were clean, professional. Articles about innovation, leadership, strategy. Photos of her at conferences, composed and assured, never mentioning him. She hadn't rewritten history to make herself look like a victim. She had simply outgrown the version of life that included him. That was the sharpest cut. Julian had believed power meant permanence, that success could freeze people in place, keep them orbiting around him. But the truth was simpler and crueler. Power only lasted as long as people chose to believe in it, and no one believed in him anymore. Across the city, Madeline left her office early and picked up Ethan. They stopped for pizza. They laughed about something small and unimportant, the kind of moment Julian once skipped without noticing. Later that night, Madeline stood by the window of her apartment, watching the lights come on across Manhattan. She didn't feel victorious. She felt settled. The past had taken its place behind her. Julian, alone in a city that no longer echoed his name, finally understood the full shape of his punishment. He hadn't been destroyed. He had been replaced. Because the deepest consequence of betrayal is not loss, but being forgotten by the life you once controlled. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, ordinary moments Madeline never would have noticed in her old life. Mornings without panic, evenings without dread, the absence of tension where fear used to live. She learned quickly that peace wasn't loud. It was consistent. She moved into a modest apartment near Central Park. Nothing extravagant, just warm and filled with light. Ethan chose his own room. He taped drawings to the walls and left his sneakers by the door without being scolded. For the first time in years, the space felt like a home instead of a performance. Madeline started walking in the park every morning before work. No phone, no emails, just movement and breath. She watched parents rush their kids to school, joggers pass with headphones in, couples arguing softly over nothing important. Life, unfiltered. Some days, memories surfaced without warning. The penthouse, the silence, the night she was erased. When they did, she didn't push them away. She let them pass through her, acknowledged, then released. Healing, she realized, wasn't about forgetting. It was about no longer bleeding when you remembered. Ethan noticed the change before anyone else. "You don't look tired anymore," he said one night as she tucked him in. Madeline smiled. "I still get tired." "Not the sad kind," he replied. She kissed his forehead, holding back tears. At work, Madeline delegated more, trusted more. She didn't lead with fear or control. She listened. She built slowly, deliberately. The fund grew, not explosively, but sustainably. Investors respected her restraint. They trusted her judgment. Daniel watched it all quietly. One evening, after a long day, they sat across from each other sharing takeout, talking about nothing urgent. No strategy, no tension. Just conversation that didn't demand anything.
"You're different now," he said. Madeline considered it.
"I'm not fighting anymore."
He nodded. "That's what makes you dangerous." She laughed softly. Later that night, standing by her window, city lights stretching endlessly, Madeline felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Gratitude. Not for the pain, but for the strength it revealed. She hadn't just survived. She had healed. And healing, she learned, was the most permanent form of power. Madeline never planned a new life. It arrived quietly, the way real rewards often do. The first sign was time. She no longer measured her days in emergencies or fear. Mornings began with coffee at the kitchen counter, while Ethan talked about school. Evenings ended with laughter over simple dinners, the kind she once rushed through or missed entirely. Nothing about it looked impressive from the outside, yet everything felt earned. At work, the board approved a long-term expansion, not aggressive, not flashy, sustainable. Madeline signed the documents without shaking hands, without that old voice whispering she didn't belong. She did. The results proved it. One afternoon, Daniel invited her to walk through Central Park after a meeting. No agenda, no investors, just the city breathing around them. They talked about Ethan, about leadership mistakes, about how success felt different when you weren't trying to prove anything. Daniel stopped near a bench, watching people pass.
"You know," he said carefully, "you don't have to be alone anymore."
Madeline didn't answer right away. She had learned the value of pause, of choosing instead of reacting. "I'm not afraid of being alone," she said finally. "I know," Daniel replied. "That's why I'm asking." There was no grand confession, no dramatic promise, just the quiet recognition between two people who had both lost something and rebuilt honestly. Madeline smiled. "Let's take it slow." That night, Ethan noticed her smile before she said anything. "You like him," he said matter-of-factly. She laughed. "I do." "Good," he replied. "He listens." Madeline hugged him, heart full. Months later, they stood together at a small gathering, not a gala, not a spectacle. Friends, colleagues, family. No headlines, no cameras.
Just a promise spoken softly, witnessed by the people who mattered. Madeline looked around and felt it settle into place. She had her child, her work, her peace, and love that didn't demand sacrifice of self. This was the reward. Not revenge, not applause. A life built on truth. And for the first time, she knew she had received exactly what she deserved. Years later, Madeline sometimes thought about that night. Not with pain, not even with anger, just awareness. The rain, the suitcase by the door, the sound of the elevator closing behind her. That moment no longer defined her, but it had shaped her. It was the fracture that forced her to become whole. On a quiet Sunday morning,
Sunlight spilled across the kitchen table of her home.
Ethan sat nearby, focused on a model he was building, completely absorbed. Madeline watched him for a moment, her chest filling with something warm and steady. This was the life she had fought for, not perfection, but presence. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Midtown Capital finalizes restructuring after leadership fallout. She didn't open it. That chapter had ended without her participation. Julian Whitmore was no longer her lesson to process or her wound to examine. He existed only as proof of something she had already learned. That losing everything had not been the end. It had been the correction. Later that day, Madeline walked through Central Park with Daniel beside her. The city moved around them, unaware of the quiet victory unfolding in plain sight. No headlines followed her now, no whispers, just respect earned slowly, solidly. "You know," Daniel said, breaking the silence, "most people never recover from what you went through." Madeline smiled softly. "Most people never stop trying to be chosen." They stopped near a bench, the skyline visible through the trees. Ethan ran ahead, laughing, safe. Madeline understood something then, with absolute clarity. She had not returned to prove anyone wrong. She had returned to claim what was right. Her dignity, her voice, her future. That night, as she tucked Ethan into bed, he asked, "Are we okay now?" Madeline kissed his forehead. "We've always been okay." After the lights were out, she stood by the window, city glowing below, and felt no need to rush toward tomorrow. She had arrived, not at the top of a hierarchy, but at the center of her own life. And that was the ending no one could take from her. Because when a woman survives erasure and chooses herself, the world eventually adjusts, and that is the truest form of justice. So, the story has come to an end. And if you're still here with us right now, that tells me something important. It means something in this journey touched your heart in a quiet but real way. Maybe it reminded you of a moment when life pushed you to the edge. Maybe it echoed a choice you're facing right now. Or maybe, like Madeline, you've learned that being erased doesn't mean being finished. There's a quiet truth at the core of this story, one the Stoics spoke about long before our time. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Madeline didn't heal by controlling others or rewriting the past. She healed by choosing integrity, patience, and self-respect when no one was watching. That's real power. Another Stoic idea reminds us, what stands in the way becomes the way. The pain that tried to break her became the path that rebuilt her. And that's something we can all carry into our own lives. Healing isn't loud. Justice isn't always dramatic. Sometimes the deepest victory is simply living well, honestly, and without fear. If this story resonated with you, please like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that heal, not just entertain. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. This story is a work of fiction created for storytelling and emotional inspiration. While the characters, events, and situations may feel realistic or familiar, they are not intended to represent real individuals, real companies, or actual legal cases. Any resemblance to real people or organizations is purely coincidental. The purpose of this narrative is to explore universal human experiences, such as resilience, personal growth, family bonds, accountability, and
Healing After Hardship. It is meant to encourage reflection and positive discussion, not to provide legal, financial, or personal advice.
Viewers are encouraged to interpret the story as a dramatized illustration of life lessons, rather than factual reporting. We strive to create content that is respectful, ethical, and uplifting, with a focus on emotional truth rather than literal events. Thank you for understanding and for engaging with this story in the spirit it was intended.